Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief for May the 4th. May the 4th be with you, 2024. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. This is Saturday, May the 4th, and I waited until today to do the brief, not so that I could make that comment, but I wanted to read the Foreign Interference Inquiry report that just came out yesterday from Justice Hogue, who is conducting the inquiry. Really interesting report, long report, but with a good, effective, well-written summary. So I'm going to get into that. That's going to be the final story and place where I spent a little bit of time at the end of the video here today. There's another report that came out this week as well, and that was from the Mass Casualty Commission Progress Monitoring Committee, chaired by former Court of Appeal Justice Linda Oland. They issued a progress report as well. I'll talk about that as well. So those are the two bigger stories that I wanted to get into this week. A few quicker hits that I'll start with, though. I want to talk about the Online Harms Act, the Notwithstanding Clause, the McGill protests. Jeremy MacKenzie made a court application. This is the founder of Diagalon. And the police paraphernalia. There was a guilty pleas to charges of possessing police paraphernalia this week. First time that law has been utilized, or at least that there's been a guilty plea to that. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. And a few other things. There's a fourth teen charged in the Ahmad Al-Marak killing. An update from the RCMP on the two deaths in Bass River, and something out of Ontario. The Peel Regional Police Service had applied to the court for permission to have names of officers in disciplinary proceedings in a lawsuit kept confidential. So we'll talk about that a little bit too. All right, so back right to the top, the Online Harms Act. So this is working its way through Parliament, but what I just wanted to mention this week was just a reminder that we still haven't received a charter statement. Now, this is by law something the government is obligated to provide anytime they bring in legislation, is a statement, an opinion from the government to say this is how and why we think this legislation is charter compliant. And they haven't done this with the Online Harms Act yet, and I think it's going to be a challenging statement to draft with the difficult, I guess, conflict between the rights of freedom of expression and the regulatory and legal burdens that are being placed on those freedoms through the Online Harms Act provisions, the proposed act. And so waiting to see what the government, how they're going to walk that line in their charter statement. Relevant this week because the government has been, and some parts of the media have been critical of the opposition leader Pierre Poilievre for comments made to a policing group about the possibility that a government under him would use the Notwithstanding Clause for sentencings for parole situations around multiple murderers. And say, well, if you're going to use the Notwithstanding Clause there, you might use it anywhere. Okay, well, what is the Notwithstanding Clause? First, maybe that's something important to, I guess, say, is that it's a part of the charter that says you can override the charter in a sense in certain cases, but you have to declare you're doing so and use the Notwithstanding Clause. We're going to bring, even though we know that this is not charter compliant, we are going to do it nevertheless. And so thinking in terms of mandatory minimums or consecutive sentences for multiple murders was the context in which he used it. But they say, well, you can't do that, you should, and some on the left and the media will say, well, you should never. The federal government has never used the Notwithstanding Clause, and that a potential prime minister should commit to never using the Notwithstanding Clause. But I would say the opposite is true. You should never commit to not using it, because what if the courts make a particularly egregious ruling and, you know, it's a problem. You can't just say you'll never use it and give away that authority in a sense. So it'll be rare if ever used, but didn't think there was anything inappropriate about the context in which it was brought up this week. But ironic that the government would be critical of that while not bringing in a charter statement yet on their signature justice legislation. Okay, interesting case out of McGill. So we've been seeing these protests cropping up on campuses, mostly in the States, but a few now in Canada, including at McGill. Some students brought in, and this is all to do with the Middle East conflict, which is unfortunately coming to Canada and the North American with greater focus and emphasis, I guess. So these McGill protests, there were some students, Jewish students, who applied to the court for an injunction against the protest, and the court didn't grant the injunction. One of the tests for granting an injunction, because that's you're again butting up against freedom of speech and expression, as ill-informed as it may be in some cases, you still have the right to protest and these such things. Well, part of the test would be whether there is irreparable harm taking place, and in the Quebec court found that there was no evidence that there was these threats and risk of violence at that point, at least in the protests. So good in that sense. We're not seeing like we're seeing at UCLA and Columbia and some of these other more bigger U.S. schools. All right, so we'll see where those protests go. There seem to be picking up some steam, but at the same time, it's the end of the school year, and it's possible that those will sort of peter out. Let's hope so. All right. The other Canadian news story that had some steam this week was Diagalon, and this had a political connection as well, of course, with Pierre Poilievre stopping at the New Brunswick, Nova Scotia border to visit those protesters, and they had the little Diagalon symbol. Well, the Diagalon founder, Jeremy MacKenzie, was in court in Nova Scotia. He was charged, you might remember, with protesting outside Dr. Strang's home. Dr. Robert Strang, the chief officer of public health in Nova Scotia, during the pandemic. And so he was charged with harassment, and so he made an application, his lawyer did, in the Provincial Court, to say that these charges were an abuse of process because they were politically motivated. He was trying to tie I guess somebody who was in the provincial government security, like helping Dr. Strang with security, who was sort of a liaison with the RCMP, who eventually laid the charges, and the suggestion was that this was political pressure being placed on the RCMP by the provincial government, by the Premier's office. Judge Jill Hartland ruled that there was no evidence of any political pressure whatsoever in the prosecution, and the application was rejected. So McKenzie's going to have to go ahead with that trial, or probably enter a plea deal, but we'll see if he proceeds with the trial. But during the course of the story, anyway, I think MacKenzie made a comment about Diagalon again, which he says is not this. MacKenzie, being a former soldier, served in the Canadian Armed Forces. He's anti-government, all these things, but says Diagalon is not an organized entity. It's just a bunch of people who listen to his podcast, and not much of a danger at all. Seems like sometimes, say our Prime Minister do this, that you elevate somebody because you're trying to make a political point and tie your political opponent to something. You end up elevating these small-time, kind of nobody protesters and make them into some big boogeyman, and overinflate their effect, their cause. and do them a favor as much as anyone else by doing so. So, but not doing us a favor by sort of dragging the discourse into that territory. So anyway, MacKenzie will have to face those charges. The last small story I want to talk about, yes, this police paraphernalia charge. So this, the guy named Colin James Penny out of Sydney, and unfortunately not a perfect test case for these police paraphernalia things, because he had guns, thousands of rounds of ammo, lots of much more serious charges. Well, it's all going to go in the mix, of course, because having the guns, having the ammo, and having the police paraphernalia makes you all that much more dangerous, of course. It'll be interesting to see where this goes in terms of a sentence. He's going to be sentenced in June. See where what kind of a sentence the court hands down in this kind of a case. 4 years after the mass murders in Nova Scotia. A couple of few stories that we'll get to tomorrow night, more so on the Sunday night show with Paul Palango and Jordan Bonaparte. This situation, the Ahmad al-Marak killing in Halifax, 16-year-old Syrian refugee moved to Nova Scotia. A fourth teen, another 16-year-old, so two 14 and two 16-year-olds have now been charged in that killing. So we'll get into that, I'm sure, tomorrow night. The Bass River deaths, this would be the sister of one of the people killed in the Portapic shootings. Not much information on this. The police said it's foul. They've ruled out foul play, and so that's it. They've closed the. They're not going to say anything more for privacy reasons. We'll see what Paul has to say about that. And then this other one is the Peel Regional Police Service. There's a lawsuit against some of their officers, and the police service had applied to have the officers' names kept secret, and the court said this is not appropriate whatsoever. When you take on the role of become a police officer, that you understand in doing so that your actions are almost all of your actions are suddenly public, and you can't keep your name secret under those circumstances. So that's what's happened with that case. I'm sure Paul will have something to say. I'd like to dig into that one. All right, so last couple of things I want to talk about are these two big reports that come out this week. And I'm going to start with the Progress Monitoring Committee, the Mass Casualty Commission Progress Monitoring Committee report. This is chaired, like I said, by former Court of Appeal Justice Linda Oland, who is only the temporary chair. So this is the 6-month report, and it seems like a little late for that, but this is their first report. But she's only the chair until for the next few months, until June, I think. And so we'll see if this changes. But I'm going to talk about what's in the report and some of the criticisms of it. Big criticism of this report. So what they're doing is they've been appointed by the federal and provincial governments to monitor the implementation of the recommendations from the Mass Casualty Commission. Problem with this is that this committee report, all right, back up for a second, the committee is made up of many different stakeholders, from the police, from the community, gender-based violence groups, family members. It's a wide variety of people, federal and provincial government representatives, and they're supposed to operate by consensus, which seems like a big task in the first place. They also operate under secrecy, so we don't really get any dissenting opinions or other views. We only get what we hear from Justice Oland, former Justice Oland. We do not get any evaluation of progress. So in none of these situations does the committee say, well, okay, while the province is doing this, that seems a little slow. That seems on time. That seems to be fitting with what the recommendations say. They just sort of tell us what's happening and expect us to come out with, to make our own minds up, which is putting a lot of which is putting a lot of responsibility on the reader. And it's like the committee itself, which is sort of designed to get very little done and reveal very little, just by the way it's set up. Acting by consensus when you have so many different disparate voices and priorities and perspectives on things is a hard way to go. And then not allowing any dissenting voices to speak doesn't allow for anyone to say, well, actually, you know what? Many of us think the RCMP isn't going very fast or whatever. Okay, so let's see here another sort of news item out of this. The RCMP is definitely not going to close depot. I don't know if they've said that officially anywhere else, but they basically told the Progress Monitoring Committee that they're not even thinking about that. And when I read this, I was like, okay, well, surely the Progress Monitoring Committee will be critical of that, because that was a very clear recommendation of the Mass Casualty Commission, and they were not. They didn't. They just said it, that's what the RCMP told them. So what's happening? The province has working groups made up of bureaucrats, fairly senior bureaucrats. They say there's been some funding increases, but when I read through the report, most of the language talks about ongoing work, that they are, quote, engaged in certain things. The word will appears 86 times. Something they're doing will impact, will support, will be made. Things will happen in the future. I guess a couple of things I would say even this though, so the province is engaged in a comprehensive review of policing. They have hired consultants, Deloitte, and they have a committee hired to do a review of policing. Well, wasn't that what the commission, I guess, recommended that? But man, you think we would have enough information to make at least some judgments as to where this is going, but they want to do a review. So another delay, sort of bureaucratic delay. It says the RCMP is engaged in sweeping modernization efforts have been in the past 5 years. I think many people would be a little surprised at that kind of a comment, but that's what the committee says. CERT, the Serious Incident Response Team, there were some recommended regulatory changes. Well, those changes are, quote, being considered. So doesn't seem like much. Public alerts, the emergency management ministers from around the country have, quote, instructed their respective teams to consider the MCC recommendations. Again, not very much going on there. Bill C-21, federal legislation on firearms, has increased penalties for cross-border smuggling, so I guess that's something. Public Safety Canada, regarding contract policing, is, quote, consulting stakeholders. So again, nothing happening, just more consultations. The RCMP, there was one allegation of one of the officers having consumed some rum before going on duty, that they have a, quote, fit for duty policy now. I thought they would have already had one. All right, so that's what's going on there. Very disappointing. The next chair, so the initial chair of the committee has sort of set the tone. It's hard to imagine that a subsequent chair is going to be chosen for any reason other than that they'll continue that tone, but it's certainly not doing any favors to the public that's trying to evaluate how progress is being made. Difficult to parse through this report, difficult to read it, and really just seems like there's further consultation taking place on all these things, or at least people claim to be consulting and meeting and thinking about these things, but nobody's really doing very much is sort of the overall conclusion one reaches when you read through and muddle through these documents. Okay, so I wanted to talk about that one first because I'm actually more happier with the Foreign Interference Inquiry report. And I was going to suggest that part of the reason is that it's written by Justice Hogue, a judge. I don't know if Justice Oland had the pen on the Progress Monitoring Committee report, but that report seemed like it was written by a bureaucrat. This foreign interference report is written by a judge. Like, a judge is trying to write so that they're thinking how they reach their conclusions, the logic, the logical progression of it all. They try to explain that as clearly as possible, because a judge is used to writing not only for the parties that are involved, but also for the court of appeal that's above them, that's going to evaluate whether the judge reasoned properly. And so they're used to writing in such a way as to be explicit in their reasoning and all this stuff. Whereas a bureaucrat is sort of the opposite. They want, it seems like they want to hide what they're really thinking in the report, and they just sort of, rely on bureaucratic language and vague sort of phraseology to sort of to muddy the waters a little bit and seem like they know what they're thinking without really knowing. So anyway, general comment on reading reports. So this one is interesting. So you've probably seen the headlines. Yes, Justice Hogue feels that has found that there has been attempts at foreign interference, primarily from China, and it doesn't happen. It's not like foreign interference in terms of rigging the election machines or that, but earlier on in the process. So the Handong situation in Toronto, where these students of Chinese descent were bussed in from outside the riding, given false paperwork, and told to vote for Handong as the nominee. This, so you're affecting. This is a safe Liberal seat, so it was fairly clear that whoever the Liberal candidate was going to be was going to win. So they wanted to make sure that these state actors, that it was an MP who was going to be friendly to Beijing. So Justice Hogue also talked about the information that was provided to the Prime Minister on that and his lack of action at that time. There was other comments on foreign interference efforts involved misinformation, and there was a Conservative MP who, there was media reports and online activity suggesting that he was going to shut down WeChat, that he was anti-Chinese, and this was also, there was misinformation campaigns against Aaron O'Toole as well, a Conservative leader in the last election. And so Justice Hogue has found that these efforts were taking place, and that there was a lot of different tactics. Like the tactics, she says, long-term collaboration of long-lasting relationships with their target, financial support, bribery, blackmail, threats, disinformation campaign, cyber attacks, and use of proxies. So lots of different attempts to affect the Canadian election. And she says, interesting situation, actually kind of similar to in a way, to the dilemma on the campus protest. But she says, foreign actors know that a liberal democracy is going to set a high bar for calling something election interference because people have the freedom of speech. Just because you're advocating something that may favor a foreign country doesn't mean that you're under anybody's influence. You might just be saying that because that's what you think, and you're free to say so. Well, you don't want to restrict the freedom of thought, freedom of expression unduly unless it's called for and unless there's some linkage. But she found, so foreign actors know that, and they'll push up to the limits, but they won't push, typically, she said, beyond what they feel the limits will be, because they want to stay under the radar and not be brought to light as it has been. So that, so you think, well, all right, was there any fault in all this? And there's a little political fault. You have to think with the government, the Prime Minister, those around him, you can imagine that they had a dilemma of not wanting to be seen to be antagonizing China, or these other countries with allegations, but then they allow it to happen. And they just seem disinclined to want to delve into the details. and disinclined to want to find out any negative stories with a Chinese connection. So if you're looking at fault, CSIS may not have been certain with their intelligence, and there's some discussion in the report about what is intelligence versus what is evidence. Evidence informs intelligence, but intelligence is not. You're hearing it from sources. You're getting this, and you're understanding this to be the case, and then you pass that on, and somebody else can, police can do investigations and find more evidence of certain things, but in all that mix, there just seemed to be a disinclination to go out and find out what was happening and defend the democratic system. So we'll see now. Justice Hogue did also say some important things. First of all, she said she felt good about the level of cooperation that she's received. And that the confidential documents there's still some need for confidentiality, but she says the confidential documents and the portion of her report that is confidential are not essential to the public understanding of the situation. So interesting work, and so she's going to continue to now explore what should be done to bolster the system. The other finding that she's made so far is that this system set up during an election time where there's sort of a caretaker government. I mean, the ministers are still in place. There's still a government. But, you're not supposed to make really political moves as a government during that time. It's a caretaker government. So what happens for the election side of it? Well, there was a high-level committee of bureaucrats appointed to monitor any election interference attempts and notify the public if there was something that would affect the election. Well, Justice Hogue is critical of this process, saying that it seems like the bar is set too high, and that there needs to be some adjustments to that. So the next part of her work is going to be that side of it. Saying, all right, now that we know what attempts are being made, what kind of attempts are being made, we now need to bolster certain aspects of our elections system and make sure that doesn't affect the next election. So interesting stuff to come in the coming months, I think 6 months or so, with the foreign interference inquiry. She was very appreciative of the people working on it, the lawyers and such that are working long hours to get these done on time. So credit to them for that, because that does seem like a lot of material to review. Oh, interesting, just one last point on that is that Justice Hogue is not making findings of credibility, she's saying at this point. So that's, sort of taking things at face value in some cases. But that, again, that doesn't seem to have affected her overall findings throughout this. So interesting stuff, and hopefully, anyway, just based on this side of her report, it gives me confidence that she's going to come up with some good recommendations to defend the next election better against foreign interference attempts. So that's that. So that's everything I wanted to talk about this week, and I want to encourage you to follow along tomorrow night. Sunday night show at 9:15 p.m. We'll be live on YouTube on the Nighttime Podcast Network, and I'm sure we'll be getting into some interesting stories then as well. So until then, and until next week, back here on the Rogers Brief, thank you all for watching, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.